Hi, everyone.
Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are joining us from today. Welcome to the first webinar in our series, COVID-19 Pre-Existing Disparities Exposed. My name is Amy Hong, and I serve as the Senior Executive Director of Education and Engagement at the General Board of Church and Society, and I will be moderating this webinar along with my colleagues, Reverend Katie Monforte and Reverend Junior Remore. Today's webinar will be focused on how COVID-19 has magnified the pre-existing conditions of racism and discrimination towards communities of color in the United States by first looking into the history of institutional and systemic racism. Second, to learn how the system is impacting communities of color during this pandemic. And lastly, how to move forward from this pandemic without perpetuating the systems that continue to harm. Before I introduce you to our great panelists for today, I want to bring your attention to our agenda for the webinar. During the panel discussion, feel free to type a question for our guests. To do so, you will see a question and answer button on the bottom, and you can input your questions there. The questions will be answered during the Q&A portion of the webinar with Reverend Katie Monforte. After the Q&A, Reverend Junior Remore will speak on what Church and Society is doing on this particular issue and how you can take action, which will bring us to the close of our first webinar. I am honored to introduce you all to our panel for today. Dr. Kamala Phyllis Jones is a family physician and epidemiologist whose work focuses on naming, measuring, and addressing the impacts of racism on the health and well-being of the nation. She is the 2019-2020 Evelyn Green Davis Fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University and the past president of the American Public Health Association. Her career has included both teaching at Harvard, Morehouse, and Rollins School of Public Health at Emory, and public health practice at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Her allegories on race and racism illuminate topics that are otherwise difficult for many Americans to understand or discuss, recognizing that racism saps the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. She aims to mobilize and engage all Americans in a national campaign against racism. Next, we have Mr. Kevin Ellis, who is the current Chief Executive Officer at the National Congress of American Indians and is a member of the Forest County Potawatomi community. He has years of experience working in Washington, D.C. as both an attorney and government relations practitioner. Throughout his career, he has built strong working relationships with key congressional offices, relevant administrative agencies, and other advocacy organizations to strategically advance top priorities for Indian country. Next, we have Professor Russell Zhang, who is the chair and professor of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University. He's a scholar of race and religion. He's written At Home in Exile, Finding Jesus Among My Ancestors and Refugee Neighbors, which is a spiritual memoir about doing urban ministry for 30 years in Oakland, California, and Family Sacrifices, the Worldviews and Ethics of Chinese Americans. With the organizations Chinese for Affirmative Action and Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council, he helped to establish the Stop AAPI Hate Center. Next, we have Reverend Dr. Giovanni Arroyo, who is the team leader for program ministries at General Commission on Religion and Race, where he has designed and led initiatives to promote institutional equity, vital conversations, and develop culturally competent leadership and ministries. He's a native of Puerto Rico and grew up in New York City. He served as a pastor in New York Annual Conference and is currently an elder of the Baltimore, Washington Annual Conference. Thank you all so much for being with us here today. To begin our conversation on racism and discrimination during COVID-19, I want to invite Dr. Jones to share with us one of the many allegories that she uses to teach race and racism.
Delighted to share one of the many allegories that I use to talk to people about race and racism, and most of them are based on something that had happened to me in my own real life. This story, which is, if I only have like 4 minutes to talk to people about racism, this is the one I share. And I'll tell you the moral already. The moral of the story is that racism really does exist. So what really happened to me in my life for me to make this into a story was that as a medical student, one Saturday, first-year medical student, studying hard on a Saturday, diligently nose in the books, some friends come over. So what do? We all start studying long and hard. And it got late and we got hungry and I had no food in the apartment, which was quite typical of me. My friends understood. They said, okay, Kamara, let's go into town and find something to eat. So we go into town and we find a restaurant and we walk in and we sit down and the menus are presented and we order our food and the food is served and there we are eating. So not a very remarkable story yet. But as I sat there with my friends, I looked across the room and I noticed a sign, and the sign was a startling revelation to me about racism. So now I've intrigued you and you're like, Dr. Jones, what did the sign say? What did the sign say? The sign said, open. So now I know I've lost most of you. So let me recap. Here we are sitting in a restaurant eating. I look across the room. I see a sign that says open. And if I hadn't thought anything more about it, I would have assumed that other hungry people could walk in, sit down, order their food, and eat. But because I knew something about the two-sided nature of those signs, I recognized that indeed the restaurant was closed because of the hour, and that other hungry people just a few feet away from me, but on the other side of the sign, would not be able to come in, sit down, order their food and eat. And do you know what? I hadn't been advancing my slides. I'm so sorry. So anyway, so here we are eating, and now the thing won't advance. Okay, there's the open, and the restaurant was closed. And the people just a few feet away from me, but on the other side of the sign, wouldn't be able to come in, sit down, order their food and eat. And that's when I recognized that racism structures open, closed signs in our society, that racism actually structures, if you will, a dual reality. And so for those who are inside the restaurant, sitting at the table of opportunity eating, and they look up and they see a sign that says open, they don't even recognize that there's a two-sided sign going on, because it is difficult for any of us to recognize a system of inequity that privileges us. So, for example, it's difficult for men to recognize male privilege and sexism. It's difficult for white Americans to recognize white privilege and racism. It's difficult for all Americans to recognize our American privilege in the global context, except we got a little taste of that with Ebola, did we not? But certainly not here with COVID-19. Yet those people who are on the outside are very well aware that there's a two-sided sign going on because the sign proclaims closed to them, but they can look through the windows and see people inside eating. So back inside to the restaurant, to those who ask, is there really a two-sided sign? Does racism really exist? I say, I know it's hard for you to know when you only see open. In fact, that's part of your privilege, not to have to know. But once you do know, you can choose to act. So it's not a scary thing to name racism. It's actually an empowering thing to name racism. It doesn't even compel you to act, but it does equip you to act so that if you care about those on the other side of the sign, which is an if, but if you do, you could even talk to the restaurant owner who is, after all, inside with you. And you could say, restaurant owner, there are hungry people outside. Why don't you open the door? Let them come in. You will make more money. And oh, the conversations we could have. Or maybe what you'll do is pass food through the windows. Or maybe you'll try to tear down that sign or break through that door. But at least what you won't be doing is sitting back saying, wonder why those people don't just come on in and sit down and eat, because you'll understand something about the two-sided nature of that sign. So I give you this story this morning or afternoon so that we can all understand that racism is structuring open-closed signs in our society, two-sided or multi-sided signs in our society. And to challenge you with a question that we won't be able to discuss in depth today, but I challenge you to remember this story and share it with others, and then discuss how could people who are born inside the restaurant know something about the two-sided nature of that sign? Because in fact, there are many, 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 many ways to know. So thank you, Amy, for inviting me to share that story. Sorry that I was thinking I wasn't having slides and I didn't advance the slides. So anyway, but there you have it.
Thank you so much for sharing the dual reality, the Western Saga allegory, and providing a good place for us to start engaging in this dialogue. So we're going to actually start going into the questions, and just to let all of those that are listening, we sent these questions in advance, and so it's not a surprise question for our panelists. The first question actually goes back to Dr. Jones. The coronavirus is having an extremely disproportionate impact on communities of color, in particular African Americans and the Latinx community. How should we understand this reality, and what is the story, the history these numbers reveal, and what is this injustice telling us about racism, where it lives, and how it exists, especially during this pandemic?
Yes, well, this is the big question for our country right now. And so I'm going to start back in December of 2019, when we started understanding that there was this virus to which no human on this planet was immune. It came to us from bats, maybe through pangolins, maybe through other things, but no human was immune. So one would know that if opportunity were equally distributed across the world, or at least in this country, and if exposure to risk were equally distributed across the world, or at least in this country, there would be no way we could slice and dice the population, right? And find any group differences in how many people were infected or how many people were dying from this virus. So the fact that we started documenting, seeing and documenting profound disproportionalities in terms of the numbers of infections and deaths for Black folks, for Latinx folks, for Indigenous folks in this country, shows that opportunity is not equally distributed in this country. And exposure to risk is not equally distributed. In fact, that it's very much distributed by race. And so racism, that thing that I was just illustrating with my story, racism is actually the system that structures opportunity and assigns value by race in this country. So what COVID-19 did was pull the covers all the way off, the sheets, I like to say, pull the sheets off of racism in the US and exposed all of the structured inequity that is characteristic of our society. It's foundational in our nation's history, continues to exist. Many people are in denial that racism exists. That's why I even have to tell my dual reality story just to convince people, yes, racism does exist, even though everything proclaims open to you when you look through your lens. So how is racism turning into COVID-19? Two ways. People of color are getting more infected. And then once infected, people of color are dying more often. Now, to explain why people are getting more infected, that also has two things. Black people and other people of color are more infected because they are more exposed and less protected. More exposed through frontline jobs, more exposed by being overrepresented in jails and imprisoned people and unhoused people. So more exposed, even with a family member coming home and living in tight quarters or densely populated communities, more exposed, right? Then in that more exposure, also less protected. So in many of these frontline jobs, which are low paid and are just now being recognized as essential in terms of transit drivers or grocery clerks or postal workers, warehouse workers, meat packers, sanitation workers, all of this, all of a sudden now being recognized as essential, but still not protected as essential with personal protective equipment or not even given hazard pay. So that's why we're more infected. Once we're more infected, we're more likely to die because the burdens of racism have made us carry in our bodies more chronic disease that makes, once you're infected with the infection, makes you have a worse outcome, and we have less access to health care. So it's more infected, once infected, more likely to die because we're more infected because we're more exposed, less protected. We're more likely to die because we're more burdened by chronic disease with less access to health care.
Thank you so much. Mr. Alice, this is a question for you. Unfortunately for Indian country, COVID-19 is not the first pandemic that has devastated the community. Earlier this week, Navajo Nation surpassed New York and New Jersey for the highest per capita coronavirus infection rate in the US. And like other communities of color, systemic inequalities have added to greater health disparities, like we just heard from Dr. Jones, for Native Americans. How has history informed the ways that Indigenous communities have responded to COVID-19? Can you share with us some of these barriers and what the current barriers are that tribes are facing during this pandemic? Please unmute yourself.
Amy, thanks so much for that question. It's a great question. And Indian country suffers a lot of barriers. As of this morning, there were 7,753 known cases of COVID-19. 4,200 plus of those are in the Navajo Nation. As you represented, the nation now outpaces the state of New York. It's been a history of chronic disrespect, and this country's had a schizophrenic relationship with Indian country. At least twice in the history of this country, there have been times when the American Indian Alaska Native was to be erased, assimilated, terminated after World War II. And you can almost think that the constant underfunding for certain services is another form of that. This country owes a treaty and trust responsibility to Indian country. When we talk about funding healthcare, when we talk about funding infrastructure, when we talk about funding education, these aren't welfare payments. These aren't handouts. These are treaty-based provisions and agreements. When Indian country gave up millions, hundreds of millions of acres for settlement, it's all memorialized in treaties, still recognized by the Supreme Court today, to have forever healthcare, education, infrastructure, economic development funded by the federal government. So this should not be a discretionary line item every year in an appropriations bill. It should be mandatory. We've seen, much like our last speaker, the health disparities within Indian country are off the charts. All the diseases and health, chronic health illnesses that if a virus infects somebody that has that, it's devastating. It's likely to be fatal. So we're subject to a great fear there. The annual healthcare spend per capita in the United States for outside of Indian country is just under $10,000 a year. In Indian country, it's $3,700 a year. For no apparent reason, 1/3 of the cost. And you want to talk about access to healthcare, we're talking about very rural communities, reservation communities that are hours sometimes away from a healthcare facility. When the pandemic broke out, there were only 1,257 beds in IHS in Indian country total, 36 ICU beds. That's across the country, servicing 2.5 million people that live on reservations. So the long distance, the lack of adequate health care, the access to health care, and then you throw on top an overcrowded home situation that's 8 times the national average. Again, because of long-term chronic underfunding for housing programs. Another thing promised in treaties to the tribal nations that would be taken care of, or enough assistance to have a way of life that you would expect in this country. That is a contributing factor and a barrier. Crowded homes, health disparities, virus equal disaster, and in large measure because of the disrespect and inability to properly fund any of those things through the last couple of decades.
Thank you so much for that answer. The next question goes to Professor Zhang. This month is Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Can you give us a short history of the term yellow peril and how it is manifesting itself most vividly in this COVID-19 crisis? And if you can share also about the history and impact of Asian Americans as being perpetual foreigners. I will share the slides that you sent, and hopefully it will be well timed.
Thanks, Amy, and thanks for inviting me. The yellow peril stereotype has been in operation since the 19th century, and it's a stereotype about the fear of Asians coming to dominate the West, to invade the United States with their nameless, faceless hordes. And the fear is because they're pagan, and the fear is because they're disease carriers. And so the yellow peril of Asians coming over was used to exclude Chinese in the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. Back then, there were 3 main diseases: malaria, leprosy, and smallpox. You can move forward. Amy, you can move it forward. Amy, if you can move the slide forward. Again. If you can move it forward, yeah, thanks. So here you can see a picture. You can see the specter of these 3 diseases stemming from Chinatown. And because of that, that argument of Chinese being disease carriers to dominate the West was used to justify interpersonal violence against Asians and also discriminatory policies. That type of pattern continued in 1900 when the bubonic plague came to the United States. Next slide. When the bubonic plague was found in Chinatown, health officials actually quarantined all of San Francisco Chinatown, roped off the area, and actually put in barbed wire. They allowed white people to leave, but they segregated Chinese to remain and get infected. In Honolulu Chinatown, they tried to burn down buildings where they found infections, but that actually spread and burned down the entire Honolulu Chinatown. So that left 7,000 people unhoused and actually spread the disease because the rats with the plague also left Chinatown. As you can see in this picture, it says the bubonic plague epidemic has parallels to today. So again, an epidemic comes from Asia. People get afraid of that peril, but they scapegoat Asian people rather than just focusing on the virus. And again, now Asian Americans today are facing pervasive, virulent attacks of racism, interpersonal violence, and also facing policies. Trump initiated the mass immigration ban. So we both have interpersonal violence and policies being enacted against us because of this yellow peril stereotype.
Thank you so much. And my apologies for the delay in this sharing of the slides. The next question goes to Mr. Alice again. Recently, there has been news coverage regarding checkpoints in South Dakota and the tension between the governor and the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe and the Oglala tribe. You kind of mentioned this already. And there was also a decision on March 27th by the Department of Interior that de-established and revoked the Mashpee Wampanoag tribal reservation status. Can you share with us more about this reality and the historic and current conflict dissension that exists for tribal communities and the federal state government?
Great, thanks, and such great, and those are two great points. I think what everybody needs to know, and many of you do, the American Indian is a place-based society group. Okay, the land is most important to us. That is the heart of who we are. It's the heart of our sovereignty. It's the heart of our people. It's the heart of our tradition, customs, and cultures. And it means everything to us. So let me take the second one first. When this administration pulled the carpet out from underneath the Mashpee Wampanoag in the middle of a pandemic is really disheartening, unfathomable, actually. There's nothing that had to happen over the last couple of weeks. It probably never needed to happen. They probably went through the process under the previous administration to get their land and put into trust, and it should have been left that way. For this administration to get in the way and do that for disingenuous reasons, we know exactly what it's about. It's about commercial gaming in a neighboring state that would be impacted by this negatively if this were to happen, who are friends of the gentleman that's sitting in the White House today. In fact, that's a fact. With respect to the Great Plains, the Cheyenne River Sioux, which we're seeing a lot of, and the Oglala Sioux, a lot of attention about, they have an absolute right. Again, they're protecting their land and their people. And not only are they trying to keep their communities safe, they're trying to keep their traditions and customs safe and their culture safe. And what I mean by that is that elders and youth interact, and their interaction plays an important role in the growth of the community and the education of who they are. Elders are the teachers. They are the leaders. And if you don't keep a virus out of that situation where you have younger people that may be asymptomatic and a little more mobile interacting with an older population that we've seen can be devastated by this virus, that could wipe out the whole top line educational and historical part of a tribal nation. And so they're protecting that. And so that way of life and that culture can continue and continue growing the tribe. So that's why it's so important. And the failure of Governor Noem and the state of South Dakota and this federal government, an unknown fact here, is the BIA director on a Friday night in the middle of this pandemic sent a letter to the Cheyenne River Sioux, Chairman Harold Frazier, demanding them to cease and desist the road blocks, and again, another very insensitive move during a difficult time.
Thank you so much for that answer. For those that are participating, just to let you know, and if you aren't already aware, the Native American International Caucus of the United Methodist Church sent a letter to the Department of Interior in solidarity with NCAI regarding the de-establishing of the Mashpee Wampanoag tribal reservation. The next question actually goes to Professor Zhang. The Stop AAPI Hate Center has been collecting data of hate crimes against Asian Americans. Can you share with us some of your findings and also the impact that media coverage and political statements have had towards Asian Americans and xenophobia? And I will do my best with the slides.
Yeah, so having shared about the yellow peril and knowing that in the past, Asians would be targeted and scapegoated for diseases coming from epidemics, we knew that we had to document what was going on because, like Dr. Jones says, people on the inside don't recognize that racism happens to people on the outside. And for Asian Americans, we knew that we were going to be impacted. And so we began to document and track incidents of racism. And so people began to submit personal firsthand accounts. And in the first weeks, we got hundreds of accounts. We didn't even publicize our website, but we got currently now over 1,900 accounts, and it's rising every day. You can see from the chart that most of the types of discrimination that Asians are facing are verbal harassment and shunning. But these aren't just mere microaggressions. Asians are being scapegoated for bringing the disease and being infected with the disease and being told to go back to China or wherever they came from. And so the hate is really palpable when you read the incidents. People are swearing at Asians, hurling racial epithets on a daily, regular basis to both elderly and children present. So that makes up a large type of the incidents we're getting. If you see on the bottom, a lot of civil rights violations of being barred from establishments, exactly the allegory that Dr. Jones talked about not being allowed into restaurants. That's happening to Asians because people are afraid that they are infected with the virus. The most heinous issues and incidents are cases of physical assault. These are actual hate crimes. We're being attacked, and we're being attacked with racially motivated orientations. So Asians are having rocks thrown at them, bottles thrown, being pushed and shoved. And a particular aspect of this disease is we're being coughed and spat upon a lot. It's really humiliating and debasing, and it's a public health threat. I think people feel like, oh, Asians came and infected us, so we're going to reinfect them. In one case on the East Coast, a white person got arrested for terrorism for coughing on grocery produce and coughing on the white cashier. But this is happening to Asians in America across the nation. We've had over 45 states reporting. And so you could make a case that Asian Americans are facing mass terrorism currently by being coughed and spat upon. And you sort of wonder, well, this is just, like Dr. Jones says, a virus. It's just a natural virus. Why are people blaming Chinese so much, and why are they connecting it so much, making the virus Chinese and making Chinese people infected? And I really, if we look at the data and if we look at news trends, you could really see what happens is that when politicians use xenophobic rhetoric, like insisting on using the term Chinese virus, you could look at one of the slides, that cements the association of the Chinese virus, if you could go back, with the virus being from China. And so repeated political statements and repeated media representations of the disease, including social media representations, these all hardwire people to, again, make that connection and then develop implicit biases that the disease is Chinese and Chinese people have the disease. So people are beginning to racially profile Asian Americans or anybody who looks Chinese with this implicit bias. We're not saying everybody is intentionally racist, but we're arguing that these sort of depictions, these multiple representations, this political rhetoric has been inflaming racism. And so people are operating out of this sort of flight or fight mode when faced with a threat. And so when they see an Asian, they feel threatened and they either flee and they shun us or they fight and attack us.
Thank you so much. Dr. Jones, on May 5th, the Allegheny County Council in Pennsylvania declared racism as a public health crisis. How should we properly understand racism as a public health crisis, and how should this understanding change the way that we think, talk, and act about racism? And how do we approach this from a multifaceted manifestations of systemic racism?
So yes, not only did Allegheny County in Pennsylvania do that, the city of Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania declared racism to be a public health crisis. A year and a half ago, Milwaukee County was the first county that I became aware of that declared racism to be a public health crisis. And just yesterday, I learned that Franklin County in Ohio had declared it. So this is a real thing, and it's happening not just It's happening at the county level, not just the state health department or the county health department. So first of all, I think it's an important recognition. And so I'm going to finish my definition of racism, which I sort of started, and then I'm going to tell you some of the history of those declarations and then some of the power that it might give us to actually move. So I define racism as a system. So it's not an individual character flaw. It's not a personal moral failing, not even a psychiatric illness, as some people have suggested, but a system of power. And it's a system of doing what? It's a system of doing two things, of structuring opportunity and of assigning value. And on what basis is the opportunity structured, and on what basis is the value assigned? It's based on the social interpretation of how one looks, which is what we call race. So as Professor Zhang was saying, if somebody looks Chinese, right? Or, the race is not biology. Let's just be very clear. And what it is the social interpretation of how one looks in a race-conscious society. I won't stay there. We can have lots of conversation among us about that. But what are the impacts of this system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on the social interpretation of how one looks, which is what we call race? It unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities, but every unfair disadvantage has its reciprocal unfair advantage. So it's also unfairly advantaging other individuals and communities. That's the whole issue of unearned white privilege, which we hardly ever talk about in this country because it makes some people, especially some white people, uncomfortable. And when I'm speaking to audiences of white people, I say, I know by saying unfair, unfair advantage or unearned white privilege, I may have made you feel uncomfortable. And you know what? I used to say to those people, shake it off, stay with me, I'll tell you more stories. But now what I say is, if you feel uncomfortable, you need to lean in to that discomfort. Because for all of us, the edge of our comfort is our growing edge. But the third impact of racism that many of us miss is that it saps the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. Again, we can have many examples of how we don't invest in the full excellent education of all of our kids because of the blinders of racism that make us think there's no genius in the barrios and the ghettos and the reservations, right? And so on and so forth. So, but now with that definition of racism, and with public health embracing that, when I was president of the American Public Health Association in 2015, 2016, I launched our association on a national campaign against racism with 3 tasks: to name racism, so to say the whole word, don't stop at race, don't stop at disparities, discrimination, implicit bias, disproportionality. These are all important things to talk about. But if you talk about all of those things and never say the word racism, get the ism out, which is the system part of it, then if we don't say racism in the context of widespread denial, we're complicit with that denial. The second of the 3 tasks is to ask, how is racism operating here, to identify levers for intervention, where racism operates through elements of decision-making. The who, what, when, and where of decision-making are structures. The written how of decision-making, these are our policies. The unwritten how of decision-making, these are our practices and norms. And the why of decision-making are our values. And finally, after naming racism and identifying targets for action, looking at the elements of decision-making, then we need to organize and strategize to act. So when a county says that racism is a public health crisis, that then is the platform on which other action can be made, and it's the platform that allows people to say the word racism. So these proclamations are important at both levels. What we need to do is make sure that people don't fall back into the somnolence of racism denial. That's what I'm calling it now. Here we all saying racism, we're recognizing the impacts in so many different levels. But if we fall back into the somnolence of racism denial, which typifies our nation, then we will have lost all of the insight that's been gained right now.
Thank you so much. Reverend Dr. Arroyo, GCORE has been offering a series of conversations with community and faith leaders to discuss disparities that are deeply embedded in our social fabric. From these conversations, can you share with us how COVID-19 has impacted these faith communities of color?
Thank you, Amy, for that question. GCORE now for almost a month has been working on real talk conversations on a weekly basis, where we have people to share their lived experiences and really be authentic. to the impact of COVID-19 beyond the qualitative data that we have access to. And through those conversations, I also highlight that there's been a clear, conscious reality that is evident, that disproportionate impact that this COVID-19 has had on Black and Brown people. Essential workers cannot stay at home, or the shelter at home orders cannot be abided by. And it's been interesting for those of us who are able to abide by those orders. It's a sign of our privilege over those who are considered essential workers, which at a disproportionate higher rate are people of color in those industries. And this has caused much concern for the safety and the well-being of how to care for those families. And when those families are impacted because they've been exposed to COVID, how are the faith leaders going to support and care for those families, even when there is these physical distancing regulations? Faith leaders are dealing with the immense loss in their communities and the challenge of just being a listening ear because of the restrictions of physical interaction has been difficult for some clergy to really be able to be present with their faithfully parishioners and other community leaders. The need for clergy also to be ministered to, because there are also needs of care due to the high level of demand upon their lives for the caring of their community. And I want to make sure that when I'm talking about caring for the community, I'm not only talking about their church, but also the constant care that they have to have with their community at large, where they're in ministry with. So there is an evidence of high anxiety and fear for COVID-19, and Black and Brown people are dying disproportionately high rates, which just highlights what has been already shared in this panel, the systemic disparities in our healthcare system. COVID-19 has forced us not to turn our heads the other way and ignore the systemic racism towards Black and Brown communities. It has exposed it to a level that shows us how racism is embedded in our systems. So one of the concerns I keep hearing from our religious leaders, especially those who are serving in racial ethnic communities, the reality that many of our racial ethnic churches might not be able to overcome the tsunami of economic hardship that this pandemic has had in their communities, which has a direct impact on how they're able to sustain and maintain their ministries open. Once again, we're naming the systemic reality. These communities are the ones that already were in need before COVID came. They already had limited resources. And now, because COVID has come into this new movement of how society is reacting, they even have more scarce materials and resources. And so those limited resources are now causing them that even those churches who have been the lifeline for those communities prior to COVID might not be there to support and continue to engage in the needs of the community. And this is a really huge concern for some of the racial ethnic leaders that I've had conversations with. And the last thing I'll say, how this is impacting the church in these terms of hardship in economic ways, is that when the stimulus package was approved by Congress, such as the payroll protection program that provided opportunity for congregations to apply for loans, which could also be forgiven, it also exposed the racial inequities that exist within our banking financial institutions towards the church. We have heard numerous accounts of churches who tried to apply and the stipulations that were put on them beyond of the regular stipulations that SBA had was automatic a way to hold them back from even being able to get access to those financial resources. However, those churches who had that advocacy voice and who really did not allow the system to you're ineligible, but continue to challenge those policies, were able to pass that barrier and apply. But this just demonstrates that the systemic racism that is evident in all the different systems that we are interacting in this time continues to become barriers for those communities that, especially Black and Brown communities, are trying to serve those who are on the front lines during this COVID-19 era.
Thank you so much. Mr. Alice, this is a question for you. As we envision life post-COVID-19, what are some steps that need to be taken to address the needs of the Native American community? And what are some ways that those of us that are not Native American can help support these needs? Please unmute yourself.
Great question again. I've been asked this question often, and probably one of the most important things is for everybody to take the time to learn about Indian country, learn about who the American Indian is, a little bit about the history. For most people in the United States, we didn't learn a whole lot about this in our high school or middle school education. There weren't classes on American Indian history. And maybe we went to a college that might have had one or two of those classes that we had to volunteer to, enroll in. And it's really important because this thing called a treaty and trust obligation needs to be fully understood by those that are young, middle-aged, and old. And when I talk to a lot of folks, and it's no fault of their own, that grew up on the Eastern Seaboard, and you talk about treaty and trust responsibility, a lot of them start twiddling their thumbs and kind of looking up in the sky when you're asking, do you know what that is? And the young people today, in their educational growth, don't get connected or learn enough about Indian country, and they grow up to be leaders. They grow up to be business leaders. They grow up to be politicians. Run organizations. And they're decision makers. And so when our issues come across their desk, either on Capitol Hill or across an association or a foundation or a business, an application, speaking to somebody's background, not having that knowledge in the context is difficult to fully, get a handle on some of the things that the American Indian still faces today. That's really critically important. There's 574 federally recognized tribes in this country, across the country. 229 of those are in Alaska. That probably surprises a lot of folks. And every single one of them is different. Every single one of them has a history. It's really important to know. Also to, instill upon your members of Congress. And once if you know who we are, what we're about, and what we need and what our challenges are, instill upon the member of Congress in your area to pay attention to our issues. And whether it's a congressman from New Jersey or a congressman from Montana, they're likely to be on some committee that matters to us. And understanding the issue is important. And also, and that impacts federal funding. But we also have there's plenty of Native organizations like ours that has funding for tribes. We right now have a COVID-19 relief fund. We were, I'm ashamed to say today we received $250,000 from the Bank of America that's going into our relief, and we're granting all of it out to tribes to fill gaps that they for critically important programs that they need to continue. Because what also a lot of people don't know, Indian tribes don't have a tax base like states and local governments. Their tax base are their businesses and their revenues from those businesses. And right now, all those businesses are closed to keep their communities safe. And so these governments don't have the resources they had to keep providing central government services. So looking to help organizations that way that send money directly to tribes and don't keep it in-house is also, very helpful for us. But all those together, education, assist, and then all of it will kind of flow in very easily, once everybody gets a good handle on who the American Indian is in the United States today.
Thank you. I believe Dr. Jones had a comment that she wanted to make.
Yes. So thank you, Kevin, for talking about the role of history and how we as a nation are ahistorical. I just wanted to quickly share that in addition to the U.S. being, folks in the U.S. being ahistorical, acting as if the present were disconnected from the past and as if the current distribution of advantage and disadvantage were just a happenstance, that's just one of 7 huge things that we think we need to target from all of our angles and from all of our communities, and especially from the church. Maybe the church has a key role in this, because I think of these as values targets in terms of being around anti-racism. So when I list them, the first one is that we as a nation are very narrowly focused on the individual, which makes systems and structures either invisible or irrelevant. The second is that we're ahistorical and act as if the present were disconnected from the past. The third is that we endorse the myth of meritocracy, the story that goes like this: if you work hard, you'll make it. Recognizing that most people, but not all people, but most people who've made it have worked hard. But even with that, there are many, many other people working just as hard or harder who will never make it because of an uneven playing field structured by racism, sexism, heterosexism, and the like. The fourth is the myth of a zero-sum game, that if you gain, I lose, which makes us work competitively, and it hides the cost of inequity, which is that it's sapping the strength of the whole society. The fifth is that we have a limited future orientation, especially manifest in our disinterest in the children and our disinterest in the planet, which are the 2 parts of the future that we can touch today. And I would say American Indian nations need to teach us in this, because many indigenous nations are thinking, when they do decision making, my understanding is they talk about 7 generations hence, a 100-year plan when you're trying to decide something. And as you talked about before, the relationship with the land is very different from our total disregard of the planet outside of Indian country. The sixth one is this myth of American exceptionalism, which makes us uninterested in learning from others, and it makes us have this sense of American entitlement. And the seventh is white supremacist ideology, the myth that there is some kind of hierarchy of human valuation. And then even if there were such a hierarchy, which there is not, to put white people at the top, which gives white people a sense of entitlement. It makes them fearful at the browning of America. It has actually undergirded the current political situation we find ourselves in now. So I just put those 7 barriers. I used to talk about them as barriers to achieving health equity. And then I started thinking of them as cultural barriers. I think they are values barriers. And to the extent that the United Methodist Church and anybody else listening can think about how do we strategically approach these barriers? Is it in how we teach our children? Is it in how we do church? I would love to hear people's responses to that, because I do not have the answer to that. I've identified the problems and I don't have the solutions.
Thank you. Actually, the next question goes to Dr. Jones. And he kind of already answered it some, but he wanted to add more details. Similar question is, as we envision life post-COVID-19, how do we address institutionalized racism in public health? What can we do to achieve health equity and close the gap in racial and ethnic health disparities?
I'll be very brief, because I jumped in with that thing and it was sort of long. So there are 3 principles that I have distilled for achieving health equity. They should guide our response during the pandemic. They should guide as we're looking at things that have been proposed and things that are not proposed, but they especially need to guide us as we try to move to a new, very different normal. The 3 principles for achieving health equity are: first, valuing all individuals and populations equally. And that means including people in decision making if you value them, investing in them if you value them, trying to seek their voice and counsel. Many ways to value. The second is recognizing and rectifying historical injustices. The historical injustices which included the taking of the land from American Indian people, right? And the near genocide there. The historical injustices that include the Chinese Exclusion Act, the enslavement of African people in our importation across the Atlantic, recognizing and rectifying all of those injustices. And the third is providing resources according to need. Not equally, but according to need. So I will just leave it there, because I could talk at length on each of those and I don't want to.
Thank you. The next question goes to Professor Jung. What can we do to reduce attacks against Asian Americans, and what platforms or strategies do you suggest? And specifically, the United Methodist Church is 89% white. What do you recommend are some steps that white Christians can take to combat racism? And I will do my best with the slides.
Oh, you don't have to do the slides. I think as people of faith, the first thing people should do is pray, actually. I think praying is an act of activism. It's calling on the high judge of heaven to actually change the situation. It's like the widow knocking on the door of the judge. And I think that's what Christians ought to be doing, because prayer not only petitions God, but it also stills our hearts. It changes our own resolve, changes our own attitudes about how we deal with them and relate to other people. So I actually don't think the church prays enough. I say that political rhetoric is maybe the main source that's inciting racism against Asians currently. And again, there are historical factors, but I think we have to hold our elected officials accountable. And, in November, we have the opportunity. Do we want to vote in hate mongers and people who use divisiveness and anti-immigrant sentiment to win elections and to rile their base? People who build walls so that we don't get resources from other countries to provide test or personal protective gear or ventilators. So I think voting is really key, actually, if we want to make a quick, easy change to the racism we're facing. I think on the sort of local individual level, especially if you don't have any Asians or American Indians around you, I actually presume, like Dr. Jones' allegory, when white people are among themselves, they probably say more racist stuff than when there are people of color present. And that's your opportunity then to actually intervene and say, no, I don't agree with that type of thinking, or we shouldn't use that type of language. This sort of relates to the bystander intervention that we need at this moment. Again, Asians are being harassed daily across the nation. And a lot of times, for example, 10% of the incidents involve youth, and 60% of the time an adult is there, but only 11% does anybody intervene. So that adult is just as much complicit in harassment and bullying of an Asian youth than the perpetrator. So what people need to do is to actually intervene and to set those boundaries. We're not going to allow any racist language here. We don't condone, it's wrong to treat people differently in this way. And then not give the perpetrator any more platform or voice, but instead attend to the targeted person. I think Christians especially need to turn to Samaritans and to check for their safety, check for their welfare, give them a voice to talk about what they've experienced. Again, you don't want to give voice to perpetrators. You want to actually set boundaries and say, we don't tolerate that. And instead, care for the marginalized, care for the people who are targeted. And what we're doing at Stop API Hate is we're giving people a voice by giving people a chance to report. A lot of the incidents aren't hate crimes. So the government's not going to do anything. But if we collect all these incidents, we can document what's going on and develop a collective voice that we're using to hold both government and corporations accountable. So I encourage people to pray. I encourage them to vote and hold elected officials accountable for their rhetoric, and then to be good bystanders, to actually intervene whenever you see any hostility or racism.
Thank you so much. This is the last question before we go into question and answer. Reverend Dr. Arroyo, what are some ways the church can respond to this pandemic? And as the church envisions life post-COVID-19, what should the faith communities be mindful of so that we don't continue to perpetuate these inequalities and disparities, racism, right? Are there any resources from G-Corps that you recommend?
Thank you, Amy. I believe communication is important for us as faith leaders, to be the first ones to communicate, but that in our communication, we do not overly reassure and focus on facts. One of the things I appreciated is the importance of having experts like you have done here today, because there's so much information that's being shared that is so overwhelming, and many times it's not even correct information. And so many people see the faith community and faith leaders as key leaders to inform them. And so how do we use that as a way to support our community? I think the church also needs to show empathy, which means willing to hear and understand the concerns of the people. There's a tendency in the church and to do and to do and to do. And many times we need to pause and listen so that we are doing something that's actually addressing the concerns of the people. And this is a time where we might need to consider the ways we partner with our churches in the community, move past the denominational lines and be willing to be in ministry together for the well-being of the community. I believe that the church can continue to use their voice of consciousness for society in naming racism, the inequities that continue to oppress and marginalize different segments of society. I believe we need to dismantle the systems that continue to operate in the advantage of white communities at the expense of Black and Brown communities. And that's hard work. And this is a time for the church to take the lead and begin to address systemic issues of xenophobia. Not putting the responsibility on communities of color, but also for white people to take responsibility in doing this hard work. Many of the essential workers are people of color, like I said before, like I work in supermarket, Amazon, warehouses, who don't have the proper protection. And the church needs to raise that voice to challenge and the management of these big corporations and putting their profits before the lives of people of color is something that we need to call for a change. In terms of the internal work of the church, post-COVID-19, I would say, what are some of the ways your church is partnering and working with communities of color? As many in the United States Church love book club. So what book studies, Bible studies is your church planning to do in 2021 to learn about the history and the reality of some of your most vulnerable communities? What challenges and commitments will your church make in its work towards anti-racism and anti-oppression? I invite you to, we've been talking about the Asian community, the impact it has had, and the xenophobia that has been expressed in many ways. Tomorrow we're having a real life conversation with two leaders in our church about xenophobia in the Asian community. And so how do we start listening to the stories of people who are constantly impacted by what's happening? And I think one of the things that I've noticed personally as a clergy person, we are constantly in this movement of naming the stuff, but I think we need to pause and remember that lives have been lost. That these are mothers and fathers, these are siblings, these are grandchildren, these are cousins, these are friends who have lost their lives due to this pandemic. And we need to take the time to remember them and to surround our love towards those families who in this day who have not had closure. And I think the church plays a vital role in how healing will happen in the days ahead and how we build community again beyond just the confines of the walls of the church. And so I think this time we are challenged as a church to reimagine what it means to be a gathered community. And what does that look like beyond just coming to church on Sunday? It's challenging us in our theology as well. And so I just want us to just be cautious that as we're doing the work, that we're also taking the time to remember those who are suffering in the midst of this.
Thank you so much. Professor Zhang has another webinar that he has to join, but he wanted to say a few closing words before he leaves us, and then we'll continue with the question and answer.
Okay, thanks, Amy. Yeah, I'm sorry I have to go now, but I'd like to thank all of the panelists and the United Methodist Church for inviting me. Asian Americans are disproportionately impacted, not only by being scapegoated for the virus, but people were boycotting our restaurants, our nail salons, even before shelter in place. So we were laid off sooner. A lot of our communities aren't getting unemployment checks or stimulus checks. So what the previous panelists have spoken about really does impact the Asian American community too, in terms of higher rates of death, especially among Pacific Islanders. And so actually, I guess one last call for the church is, besides holding people accountable and becoming that prophetic voice that I think the US needs and providing that moral vision, I think we need to actually really repent of our nation's both history and current discrimination against people of color, and to actually turn around and actually rebuild this nation based on unity and based on solidarity against racism. And like the previous speakers spoke about, fighting for equity for all. So thank you. And Amy has my contact. If you have any other questions, I could respond. Okay, sorry.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye. So we'll continue with the question and answer part. And Reverend Katie Monforte has been monitoring the question and answer box on the bottom. And so she will take over now for the Q&A.
Yeah, I'd like to begin by thanking all of our participants for their thoughtful engagement throughout this conversation. It's clear that you're grappling with the material and really wanting to know more so that you can act. Our first question is for Dr. Alice, or Mr. Alice. We had the question of how the reality of Native Americans in the urban centers, how is that reality different than the rural communities that we've been hearing about?
So with respect to healthcare, they're still suffering from the same situation. Many of our urban American Indians go to urban Indian organ health organizations. These places that are funded through federal government funding, and they are disproportionately underfunded, just like the IHS facilities that are out in rural America. They also, I didn't get touched on this too much, but access to the internet and the broadband is really bad in Indian country, right? About half the people, well, depending on where you go, don't have access. Even in the urban environments, there's folks and communities that don't have access to the internet. So telehealth and all the kinds of things that many of us take advantage of, don't think much of, because we have a phone, we have access to the internet, are barriers to the delivery of healthcare services, even in the urban environments.
Thank you. I think this next question could go to Dr. Jones. There was the discussion of health is often seen as physical. If we were to change this definition and look at the framework of being more holistic, how do you think this could help address the systematic disparities?
So I would love other people to also pitch in, but it is true that physical health, somebody first commented, it's almost as if you cut it off at the head. You don't deal with behavioral health and you don't deal with dental, oral health. It's like the physical health is everything below the head. And so there are people who are trying to, there's actually a move, I guess they call it integrated health. We're trying to get behavioral and physical health people to actually talk to one another and perhaps be co-located. Oral health is still not there, but what it means is, so being holistic means attending not even just to those things, but to the spirit and to community. I think the biggest health issue that we have is this narrow focus on the individual, which makes us feel, even when we're trying to do something, how can I address racism? How can I tackle this problem in my life? As opposed to a sense of the collective, and how can we? So I think that we need to understand that action is power. I really love, now I can't remember who gave us the 3 things to do, to vote and all like that. If it was Professor Jung, he's gone, But so we have to do those things, but we have to recognize our collective power, especially in these days. So I think that health in the individual, yes, we integrate all of that, but health in communities and healing communities is going to be about reaching out to other people and recognizing that we have power, that action is power, and that especially collective action is the most power.
Yeah, thank you for that important reminder. And I think that perfectly segues us into thinking about our action. So I'm sorry to limit our questions from our amazing participants, but our time is limited. We hope to follow up with some of the most pressing questions via email as we follow up.
Thanks, Reverend Katie. So I'd like to introduce you next to Reverend January Moore, who is the Director of Civil and Human Rights. She will be sharing what Church and Society is doing and how we as a collective can take action.
Thanks, Amy. And again, thanks to all of our fantastic panelists. I have thoroughly appreciated the conversation, and it's a perfect setup for what we're about to discuss real quick right now. So, as we've just heard, and as we know from our daily lives, COVID-19 has revealed the gross hold of systemic racism and discrimination in our society historically and presently. Today, we've discussed just a few of those examples in healthcare, employment, housing, economics, governmental policies of discrimination and underfunding or defunding, as well as hate crimes. We will continue to discuss these and other examples in the coming weeks on this webinar series. However, we can't just talk about this issue. So, picking up on something Mr. Alice said earlier, as a key piece of today's conversation, we are calling on you, all 500 plus who have been joined with us on the webinar today, to take action by contacting your elected officials. On our website, www.umcjustice.org, you will find an action alert where you can write and send a letter to your members of Congress calling on them to pass legislation that dismantles systemic racism, builds up our communities, and unequivocally stands for justice and peace for people and communities of color. Amy's keyed that up. Thanks so much, Amy. So you can see what this looks like. And in addition to the foregoing, what I just mentioned, we are calling on elected officials to ensure that COVID-19 funding legislation safeguards and secures communities of color amidst the current public health crisis and the unfolding economic crisis. So both short-term temporary relief measures as well as long-term policy reform must dismantle rather than perpetuate the structural injustices that enable white supremacy to flourish in our society. The link to this action alert will be included in the follow-up email to today's event, so you won't miss it if you registered. But even if you didn't, you can also easily find it on the homepage of our website. Thank you all for taking this important action. It is absolutely necessary and a key counterpart to today's discussion. We have to put our faith in action and make change. Amy, I'll turn it back to you. Thanks.
Thank you. So we're at the end of our first webinar, and a few announcements before we go. Tomorrow at 2 p.m. will be G-Corps' Real Talk on xenophobia and anti-racism during COVID-19 at 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time on their Facebook page. So please continue to engage on this topic. Our next webinar is next Thursday at 2 o'clock, and where we will be discussing how COVID-19 has impacted both the incarcerated and the detained. If you haven't registered for the next webinar, please register for that webinar on the Church and Society's website. Each webinar requires a separate registration. In the next few days, you'll receive an email with resources on this topic and a link to the action that Reverend Junior Ree mentioned, along with a link to this webinar, which has been recorded. And along with any of the pressing unanswered questions that were submitted during this webinar. Lastly, I want to say a sincere thank you to our panelists, Dr. Jones, Professor John, who's left, Mr. Alice, and Reverend Dr. Giovanni Arroyo for being with us today. It has been such an amazing time, and I have personally learned so much. So thank you so much. And lastly, thank you for all of you that participated. Wish you have a great afternoon and see you next week. Blessings and peace. Bye.